She did not know the man's name until the preacher said it aloud over her, and by then the wagon dust from her arrival had not yet settled on her one good dress. Cora Jane Ashford stood in the yard of a ranch she had never laid eyes on before that morning, a paper contract folded in her glove, and a fee of $40 already paid over to the matchmaking agency in Denver. And the man she'd been bought for stood across from her with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder, unable. It seemed to look at her straight on. "I paid for a wife who could keep a house and mind 3 children," he said, flat, like he was reading it off a bill of sale rather than speaking to a living woman. Not for anything past that. She heard the words land the way a slap lands, quick and stinging and over before you can brace for it, and she made herself answer plain the way she always did. "Then you'll get exactly what you paid for, Mr. Hargrove. Nothing more, nothing you didn't ask for. I keep my end of a bargain." If you have ever been measured up and found only barely sufficient by someone who never once looked you full in the face, stay with this story, because it does not end the way that yard smelled that morning. Subscribe if this is your first time finding us. Tell me down in the comments what town you're watching from tonight, and stay all the way to the end, because there is a ring in this story that gets put on twice, and the second time means something the first time never could. Cora Jane had grown up the biggest girl in a town that prized its daughters small and delicate, the kind of girl mothers pointed to as a cautionary example, and boys never asked to dance, and she had learned early the particular arithmetic of a woman built sturdy and plain in a world that only wanted its women decorative. Her own mother had died when she was 14, leaving her a silver thimble worn smooth at the crown and precious little else, and her father, a good man broken by grief and drink in roughly equal measure, had followed her mother into the ground 4 years later. And a stepmother who made it plain within a season that the house had room enough for grief, but none left over for an extra mouth. She had worked as a hired girl in 3 different households after that, learning the particular skill of making herself indispensable and invisible in the same motion, learning that a woman without people to speak for her survived by being so useful nobody could afford to ask her to leave, and by never asking for a single thing beyond what she strictly needed to get through to morning. She had built herself a rule out of that hard schooling, 3 plain parts unbending: never cry where anybody could see it and use it against her, never ask for more than the bare minimum, and always, always give the credit for anything good away to somebody else, because a woman who took credit got remembered, and a woman who got remembered got questioned, and questions were a luxury she could not afford. The advertisement had come to her by way of a church bulletin board in the boarding house where she'd been living. A plain notice seeking a capable wife for a widower rancher with 3 children and a 4th on the way at the time of his first wife's death, wages of room, board, and a proper marriage in trade for the work, and Cora Jane, 26 years old, and out of houses willing to hire her and entirely out of other ideas, had written back the same week. She had told herself, on the long train ride west and the longer wagon ride after it, that she was not hoping for anything beyond a roof that wouldn't be pulled out from under her every 18 months, that she had learned better than to hope for warmth from a man who'd paid cash money for her arrival the way he might have paid for a plow horse, and that she would do the work asked of her and take her plain, hard-won peace in exchange, and want nothing more than that, because wanting more than that had only ever gotten her hurt. Nathaniel Hargrove was, she saw within the first hour, a man who had stopped fighting for anything beyond bare survival, a long while before she arrived. He was broad through the shoulders and gone gaunt through the face, a man built for heavy work who had not been eating enough of it to keep his own frame fed, and his house, when she was shown into it, told the same story his face did. Dishes gone unwashed past the point of simple neglect, a baby crying in a back room with the thin, worn-out cry of a child who has cried past the point of expecting anyone to come, and 3 older children arranged around the kitchen with the careful, brittle stillness of children who have learned that noise and need are things that make the grown-ups around them worse rather than better. "This is Lillian," Nathaniel said, nodding toward a girl of perhaps 12, standing at the stove with a wooden spoon and a pot. She was clearly minding out of habit rather than any confidence in what she was making. She's been keeping house since her mother passed. This is Wesley, a boy of 9 or 10, arms crossed, chin jutted forward in the particular posture of a child spoiling for a fight he didn't entirely understand the terms of. And this is Ivy, a small girl, perhaps 6, sitting apart from the others on the floor with a slate and a piece of chalk, drawing the same shape over and over, who did not look up at the sound of her own name and did not speak at all. The baby's called Daniel. He was born the week his mother died. Doc says there's nothing wrong with him but grief, though I don't rightly know how a child that small can grieve something he never got to meet. He said all this in the flat recitation voice of a man reading an inventory, and Cora Jane understood, hearing it, exactly what kind of house she had walked into, and exactly what kind of work waited for her there, work far past what $40 and a matchmaking agency had bargained for. "I'll see to the children," she said, setting down her single traveling case, "and I'll keep the house, and I expect supper wants doing, given the hour." She did not ask him what he expected from her beyond that. She had learned not to ask questions whose answers she might not want, and she suspected, correctly, that whatever understanding existed between them about the marriage itself, the paper part of it signed and witnessed that very afternoon by a circuit preacher passing through, would need considerably longer to fill in with anything resembling warmth, if it ever filled in at all. The wedding itself, such as it was, took place in that same kitchen an hour later, the preacher hurrying through the words because he had 2 more stops before dark, Nathaniel's hand dry and rough and entirely without tenderness, as he placed a plain gold band on her finger. A band, she would learn later, that had belonged to his mother rather than being bought new, because there had been no money spare for new after the funeral costs and the doctor's bills from his first wife's death. And Cora Jane stood in that kitchen in her one good dress and became, in the space of a single unceremonious afternoon, Mrs. Bracel. Nathaniel Hargrove, wife to a man who could not yet look at her without his jaw going tight with something that was not quite resentment and not quite grief, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not, on the train, on the wagon, in this exact kitchen, if it came to it, and she kept that promise the way she kept all her promises to herself, silent and total. And instead she turned to the stove and finished the supper Lillian had started, and called the children to the table, would not speak, would only sit apart with her slate and her single repeated shape. Cora Jane did not force her, only set a plate within reach on the floor beside her, and let her eat there if that was where she needed to eat. And something in that small, unforced kindness made Lillian's shoulders drop half an inch. The first sign Cora Jane had that this house might, given enough patience, prove capable of softening. The first weeks passed in a blur of unglamorous labor, and Cora Jane threw herself into it with the particular ferocity of a woman who has learned that being needed is the surest form of safety she is ever likely to find. She scrubbed the house top to bottom. She found the baby, Daniel, thin and fretful on milk that had gone half sour from a goat nobody had been properly tending, and nursed him back to a healthier color within a fortnight on milk she fetched fresh and warm herself before dawn each morning. And she coaxed Lillian, gently, to surrendering the burden of the household back to an adult's shoulders, watching the girl's whole posture change over those first weeks from the brittle uprightness of premature responsibility into something looser and younger. Ad girl, finally permitted to be 12 again, rather than the accidental mother of a house too big for her to carry. She weathered Wesley's testing, his sharp remarks, and his deliberately half-finished chores, understanding the way she understood most things about grieving children, because she had once been one herself. That his anger was not really about her at all, but about a mother gone into the ground with nobody's permission and nowhere for a boy that age to safely put the fury of it. And she watched Ivy, patient and unhurried, never once demanding the girl speak, only sitting near her some evenings with her own mending while Ivy drew her single repeated shape on the slate over and over, a shape Cora Jane eventually realized. Studying it close one evening by lamplight was a rough outline of a woman's hand, the same shape drawn so many times the chalk had worn a groove into the slate itself. And Cora Jane understood, without being told, that it was the shape of a hand Ivy was trying not to forget. Her mother's hand, maybe, or the last thing she remembered clearly of her. Only kept drawing her own shapes alongside the girls some evenings. Plain domestic shapes, a cup, a spoon, a chicken, until Ivy began, without prompting, to draw alongside her, rather than alone, two sets of hands moving chalk across slate in a silence that was, itself, its own kind of conversation. Nathaniel, through all of this, remained a wall she could not find purchase against. He worked from before light until well past dark, tending a herd that had been steadily failing since his wife's death, the way everything in that house had been failing, from a species of grief blindness rather than any actual incapacity, and he came in each evening, ate what she'd cooked with a murmured word of thanks that cost him visible effort to produce, and retreated to whatever silence he kept behind his own eyes. A silence Cora Jane recognized, the longer she watched him, as the particular flavor of a man who had started a good many sentences in the 2 years since his wife died and stopped himself every single time before reaching the part that might have cost him something to say out loud. The first real trial of the marriage arrived on a night 3 weeks in, when Daniel spiked a fever so sudden and so severe that Cora Jane, sitting up with him through the black hours, became genuinely afraid for the first time since her arrival that the child might not see morning. She sent Wesley, newly proud to be trusted with something real, riding hard through the dark for the doctor in town, and she sat with the baby against her chest, cooling him with wet cloths the way her own mother had once cooled her through a childhood fever, murmuring low words that were not quite prayers and not quite anything else. Just sound meant to anchor a suffering thing to the world a while longer, and it was near 3 in the morning, the worst of the fever finally starting to break, when she looked up to find Nathaniel standing in the doorway, having come in from a night check on the herd to find his house lit and his wife awake with his son held tight against her, and something in his face watching that, cracked open in a way she had not yet seen it crack. "You didn't wake me," he said, and there was something almost wounded in it, as though her handling the crisis alone without calling for him was itself an accusation. "You needed the sleep more than I needed the company," Cora Jane said, plain, the way she said everything, a fact laid gently on the counter, rather than an argument dressed up as one. "And besides, this is what you paid for, isn't it? A wife who could mind the children without troubling you over it." She heard the small, bitter edge in her own voice. The first time she had let it show since her arrival, and regretted it faintly even as she said it, but Nathaniel did not flinch from the words the way she half expected him to. Instead, he crossed the room and knelt down beside the two of them, close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into every line of his face, and put one rough hand briefly against his son's small damp forehead, and said, "Lo, I didn't marry you for what I paid for. Not anymore. I don't rightly know what I married you for, if I'm honest. But it isn't that. Not after watching you with him these 3 weeks. It was the most he had said to her unprompted since the wedding, and it hung in the lamplit room between them like something neither one of them quite knew what to do with yet, and Cora Jane, feeling the old rule rise up in her, the instinct to deflect, to give the moment away before it could be used against her later, held her tongue instead and simply let the words sit there, unanswered but not unheard. And that itself was progress, though neither of them would have named it so at the time. The doctor arrived near dawn to find the fever already broken and pronounced the boy out of danger. And by the time the household rose properly that morning, gray light coming soft through the kitchen window, something had shifted in the marriage. Subtle but real, the particular shift of two guarded people discovering that they were perhaps not quite as alone in the house as they had each believed. The second trial came from town, and it came, as it so often does in stories like this one, wearing the clothes of concern rather than the face of open cruelty. Beatrice Langford was the wife of the town's mercantile owner and the self-appointed arbiter of who belonged where in a community that size. And she had heard, the way such women always heard everything eventually, that Nathaniel Hargrove had sent away for a mail-order bride rather than courting a proper local widow, and had further heard, with considerable interest, that the bride in question was built stout and plain rather than delicate and pretty. And she made it her particular business on Cora Jane's first proper trip into town to buy provisions, to comment on both facts loudly enough to be overheard by half the general store. "It is a curious thing, Mrs. Proctor," Langford said to her circle of companions, but pitched deliberately to Carrie, "that a man would pay good money and wait months on a letter, rather than simply marry one of our own girls, unless, of course, he wanted someone who'd work like a hired hand and never trouble him with expectations past that. One does wonder what a woman answers an advertisement like that for, unless she's got precious little else on offer at home." Cora Jane, standing at the counter with her basket half filled, felt the words land the way such words were designed to land, precise and public, and dressed up just enough to avoid being called outright cruelty, and felt the old instinct rise in her, familiar as breathing. Take up no room, let it pass. Diff the humiliation nowhere to attach, because she had given it nowhere to land. But then she thought of Lillian, home minding the younger children and growing slowly back into her proper childhood, and Wesley, still testing but softening, and Ivy, who had begun, just that week, to draw shapes beside her that were not only the single morning hand, but new shapes too, hopeful shapes. And she thought that if she let this pass unanswered in a room full of people who would carry the tale home to their own children, she would be teaching a lesson she did not want taught. And so for the first time in longer than she could remember, she turned from the counter and answered plain. "I answered it," Cora Jane said, "because I was a hired girl with no people and no prospects, same as plenty of women in this territory, and I'd rather work hard and be looked at plain than sit pretty somewhere and be looked at hollow. As for what Mr. Hargrove wanted, I expect you'd have to ask him, though. I'd wager it wasn't your good opinion he was shopping for when he wrote that advertisement, seeing as his children were half-starved and his herd was failing, and not one soul in this town, yourself included, had thought to bring so much as a casserole in the 2 years since his wife died." The store had gone quiet. The particular quiet of a room recalibrating its opinion of somebody in real time. Langford's composure slipped, just slightly, unused to being answered by a woman she had assumed, wrongly, would simply absorb the blow and slink off. It was the mercantile owner's own sister, a widow named Nora Fenwick, who kept the till most afternoons and had watched Beatrice Langford's particular brand of concern do damage in that town for the better part of a decade, who spoke next, setting down the ledger she'd been minding and stepping around the counter with the unhurried courage of a woman who has finally decided a debt of silence has come due. "I've kept my tongue on Beatrice's talk for years because it wasn't my place to speak on it," Nora said, "but I'll say plain what needs saying now. This woman rode 200 miles to a stranger's house and pulled a sick child back from a fever 3 weeks past, and mended a family half of us in this town had quietly written off as past saving, and she's done it without a single soul's help or a single word of thanks from most of us. And I'd rather stand with a woman who does that kind of work than one who stands in a dry goods store finding fault with a stranger's reasons for surviving." Mrs. Langford, robbed of her audience and her own store clerk's loyalty in the same afternoon, gathered her purchases and departed with what dignity she had left. And Cora Jane rode home that evening with her provisions and a strange, unfamiliar warmth sitting in her chest, the warmth of having been defended, publicly. She did not tell Nathaniel about the encounter, keeping her rule about giving credit away and taking up no room intact even in the retelling. But Wesley, who had ridden in with her and witnessed the whole exchange from just inside the store door, told his father over supper that night with the plain, unedited bluntness of a 9-year-old. And Nathaniel listened to the account with his jaw working the way it did when something moved through him he was not yet ready to say out loud, And afterward, once the children were down, he found Cora Jane out at the porch rail where she had taken to standing some evenings, looking out at the herd she had been steadily helping nurse back toward health in the weeks since her arrival. "Wesley told me what happened at the store," he said. "It wasn't anything," Cora Jane said, the old deflection rising automatic to her lips. "Mrs. Fenwick did the real work of it. I only said what needed saying." "You keep doing that," Nathaniel said. "Giving away what's yours to somebody else the second anybody tries to hand you credit for it. I've noticed it plenty since you arrived. You'll do a full day's work that would break a hired man in half, and then tell me it was nothing, or tell me the children did it themselves, or tell me it was luck. I want to know why a woman who's done what you've done for this house can't stand to hear it said plain." Cora Jane was quiet a long moment, looking out at the dark shape of the corral, and when she answered it was with the particular flatness of a fact she had never said aloud to another living soul. "Because a woman who takes credit gets noticed," she said, "and a woman who gets noticed gets questioned. And I learned young that the questions never go anywhere good for a woman with no people standing behind her. Where's her family? Why's she built the way she's built? What's she really after coming this far for a man she'd never met?" I built a rule out of that lesson, Nathaniel. Never ask for more than the minimum. Never take credit past what's strictly mine. Never cry where it can be used against me. It's kept me fed and unbothered for 8 years running, and I don't rightly know how to set it down now, even in a house where maybe I don't need it anymore. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment in the dark, and something in his own carefully guarded face shifted, the particular shift of a man recognizing, in another person's armor, the exact shape of his own. "I've got a rule too," he said slow, the words coming the way they always came from him. Halting, unfinished, testing the ice before he put his full weight on it. "Since Margaret died. I start a sentence and I stop before the part that cost me anything, because I got the front half of a whole life said to her once, promises about growing old together and building something that would outlast us both, and none of it turned out true. And I decided somewhere in the 2 years since that if I never finished a true sentence again, it couldn't be taken from me the same way." He stopped, and Cora Jane, recognizing the shape of the moment, the shape of a man standing at the exact edge of the ice she'd asked him to test, said nothing, only waited, the way she had learned to wait for Ivy's silences to resolve themselves on their own time. "I paid for a wife," Nathaniel said at last, "because I told myself that was safer. Business, not feeling. Nothing left to lose if it stayed a business. But I've been watching you 3 weeks now, with Daniel, with Ivy, standing up plain in a store full of people who'd have let you drown. And I don't know how to keep calling this a business anymore." He did not finish the sentence past that, but he did not need to. The unfinished shape of it hung between them, exactly as plain as a completed one would have, and Cora Jane, feeling something in her own chest loosen half an inch, did not deflect it, did not give it away, only let it land and said quiet, "I know the feeling," which was, for a woman built the way she'd built herself, its own kind of confession. The third trial, and the most dangerous, came with the drought that settled over the territory that summer, water going scarce in the creek that fed the herd, grass browning early on the range Nathaniel depended on to fatten his cattle for the fall market. And into the middle of that slow-building crisis rode Silas Crane, with a note 6 weeks past due and a proposal dressed up as generosity that was once examined close. Nothing of the kind. The bank's prepared to take the west parcel in partial satisfaction of the note, Crane said, standing in the yard rather than accepting the offered chair, the particular posture of a man who did not wish to be seen sitting easy in a house he half expected to own outright within the season. Generous terms, given the circumstances, and it would leave you the working portion of the ranch free and clear. Cora Jane, standing at the edge of the yard with flour still dusting her hands, understood immediately what was being proposed, because the west parcel held the only spring-fed water on the whole property, the one piece of ground that would keep the herd alive through a drought summer regardless of how the creek ran, and she understood, too, exactly why Crane wanted it, and for whom.
"Who's the west parcel going to?"
she asked, stepping forward, and Crane's eyes flicked to her with the mild condescension of a man unused to a rancher's wife inserting herself into a conversation about deeds and debt. "That needn't concern you, Mrs. Hargrove." "It concerns me plenty," Cora Jane said, "seeing as that spring is the only water this whole outfit has that doesn't depend on rain. And I'd wager a fair sum you know it, and I'd wager further there's a buyer already lined up who knows it too." Crane's composure slipped just enough to confirm the shape of her guess, and Nathaniel, standing beside her now, something new and steady in his own bearing that had not been there a season before, said, "Answer her plain, or take your papers back to town, because I'm done signing what I haven't had explained to me straight, and I'm through being the last man in this territory to figure out he's being robbed politely." Cornered, Crane admitted, eventually, that a cattle syndicate out of the capital had already made an offer on the parcel contingent on the bank foreclosing that piece specifically, an offer that would leave Crane's bank a tidy commission and leave Nathaniel Hargrove's remaining acreage worth considerably less without its water. "Then here's my counter," Cora Jane said, before Nathaniel could answer, and she felt him glance at her, startled but did not stop, because she had spent the drought weeks doing sums in her head every night by lamplight, the way she had once done sums to keep herself fed as a hired girl. And she knew this ground the way she knew very little else in this new life. The herd's thin from the dry summer, but it's not sick, and there's 40 head fit for early market if you drive them now, rather than waiting for the fall gather. On account of the buyers up the rail line are paying premium this year for anything that'll make weight before the drought gets worse elsewhere too. That sum plus what's owed on the note already paid this spring covers the arrears without giving up 1 inch of that spring water, which this ranch will need every single summer from now until doomsday, drought or no drought. Nathaniel looked at her, and then at Crane, and something settled into his face, final and unshaking. The look of a man who had finally stopped believing that losing was simply the shape his life was required to take. "We'll drive the herd early," he said, "and I'll want every fee your bank means to charge me itemized plain, in writing, before I sign one more paper, or I'll take my note to the bank in Millbrook and let them have an honest customer instead of a desperate one." It was largely bluff, moving a note that far along being no simple trick, but delivered flat and certain. It did its work, and Crane departed promising a written accounting within the week, considerably less pleased with his morning's business than he had arrived expecting to be. The early drive was hard, brutal work under a sun that did not let up, and the children pitched in as they were able. Wesley, prouder than Cora Jane had ever seen him at being trusted with real cattle work, rather than chores meant only to keep him occupied. And by the time the 40 head reached the rail depot and fetched a price better than either of them had dared hope given the season, the note was cleared in full with a small sum left over besides, and the spring-fed west parcel remained exactly where it belonged, feeding water to a herd that would need it every summer for years to come. It was that same week water troubles resolved and the bank's threat turned back, that fire found the barn, catching in dry hay during a night when the drought had left everything on the property tinder-brittle, and Cora Jane woke to the smell of smoke and was across the yard before she'd fully finished waking, Nathaniel already there hauling the doors wide. The two of them working together with a wordless coordination that had built itself slowly over the season without either one quite noticing until the crisis called on it all at once. It was Cora Jane who went back in for the 2 calves, too weak and too frightened to be driven out with the rest, ducking under the smoke line with her apron pressed over her mouth, and it was Nathaniel who grabbed her by both arms the moment she cleared the doors, shaking, his voice cracked wide open with a fear he had clearly never planned on showing her. "Don't you ever do that again," he said. "Don't you dare." And the two of them stood in the firelit yard with his hands still gripping her arms, neither one letting go, neither one saying anything further because the moment had already said everything that needed saying. The barn's roof came down, but the walls held, and dawn found the family surveying the wreckage together, and it was Ivy, of everyone, who broke the heavy quiet, tugging at Cora Jane's sleeve and pointing at the ruined roof, and then, in a small, rusty voice unused for the better part of 2 years, saying, "We can build it back. Papa built the whole house once. He can build a roof." 6 words, the first full sentence anyone in that family had heard from her since her mother's death, and the whole yard went still with the shock and the wonder of it. Nathaniel crossing to his daughter in 3 strides, and kneeling down and gathering her against him, and Cora Jane turned quietly to see to the calves and give them the privacy of that moment, though her own eyes stung fiercely and she let, for the first time since her arrival, one single tear escape unwatched, because there was nobody looking at her just then to see it and use it against her, and because some things she was beginning to understand were worth breaking a rule for. Nathaniel found her at the porch rail again that evening, soot still on both of them, the barn's rebuilding already being planned between them the way all their planning had come to happen lately, side by side, rather than apart. "You cried this morning," he said, gentle, no accusation in it. "I saw it, out by the corral." "I did," Cora Jane admitted, and did not deflect it, did not give the moment away to Ivy's breakthrough or the barn's survival or anything else, for the first time letting a true thing about herself simply stand unclaimed by anyone else's story. "I told myself a long time back that a woman who cries where she can be seen is a woman who's handed somebody a weapon. I've held to that 8 years running. But I looked at your girl finding her voice again this morning, and I didn't have it in me to hold the rule that hard anymore. I don't want you holding it at all," Nathaniel said. "Not with me." He turned to face her, fully, then, something in his bearing finally, entirely unguarded. "I started a sentence with you back during the drought and didn't finish it. Said I didn't know how to keep calling this a business anymore, and stopped there. I'd like to finish it now if you'll let me." Cora Jane, her heart going unsteady in a way she had not permitted it to go unsteady in longer than she could remember, said only, "I'm listening." And Nathaniel, taking a breath the way a man takes a breath before stepping onto ice he has finally decided will hold, went on. "I don't want this to be a business between us anymore, Cora Jane. I paid for a wife because I told myself grief had used up whatever was left in me for wanting things past bare survival, and I was wrong. I look up most days now, and the first thing I want to see is your face, and I've watched you turn a house full of grieving children back into a family, and stand down a banker and answer a whole store full of gossips plain, and pull my son back from a fever with your own 2 hands, and give every last bit of the credit for it away to somebody else every single time. And I want you to hear this next part plain, and let it land instead of handing it off. I love you, not as the wife I paid for, as yourself, and I'd like you to stay, not because a paper says you have to, but because this is your home now, if you'll have it. And I don't want to imagine what's left of my life without you standing right here at this rail." Cora Jane did not answer right away, and Nathaniel's face, watching her silent stretch, showed the particular fear of a man who has finally finished a sentence and cannot be certain the ground beneath it will hold. But then she turned to him, and her eyes were bright with something she had not let anyone see in 8 long years, and she reached into the pocket of her apron and drew out the silver thimble that had been her mother's, the one object she had carried with her through every hired house and every unkind winter since she was 14 years old, and pressed it into his hand. "I keep my promises," she said, the whole of her rule distilled at last down to its truest working part. "And I'm promising you now, I'm staying. Not for the roof over my head, and not for the bargain we signed that first afternoon. For you and for them." She nodded toward the house, toward Lillian and Wesley, and Ivy, and small Daniel asleep inside it, a family that had somewhere in the space of a single hard season become as much hers as anyone's blood ever could. "This thimble's the only thing of my mother's I've got left in this world, and I've carried it 8 years, like a promise to myself that I'd survive whatever came. I'm giving it to you now because I don't need it to remind me to survive anymore. I've got something worth staying for instead." And Nathaniel closed his hand around the thimble and then around her hand besides and said, "Lo, stay." The whole weight of everything neither of them had managed to say plain until that evening folded into the single word, and Cora Jane said, "I'm not going anywhere," and that was the whole of it. Vow made and answered in kind. No more needed. The second wedding came that autumn, once the note was cleared, and the barn stood rebuilt, and the herd had fattened back toward health on grass finally green again, after the drought broke, and this one was nothing like the first. There was no circuit preacher hurrying through the woods with 2 more stops before dark. The whole town came, even Beatrice Langford, arriving with a stiff smile and a gift she clearly felt obligated, rather than eager to bring, and Nora Fenwick stood up near the front of the small gathering, with the particular pride of a woman who had staked her own standing in town on a stranger's worth and been proven right. Lillian, no longer required to mother a house too big for her, stood beside her father in a dress Cora Jane had helped her sew, easy and unguarded in a way she had not been in 2 full years. Wesley stood steady and calm, his old fury long since resolved into something more like determination. Ivy talked freely now, had talked freely for months, chattering in the unstoppable way of a child making up for lost time, and she stood holding baby Daniel's hand, the boy toddling now, healthy and round-cheeked, no longer any kind of barometer for a household's grief because the grief itself had finally, gently, found somewhere proper to settle. Nathaniel placed his mother's gold band back on Cora Jane's finger a second time that afternoon, and this time his hand did not stay dry and businesslike, but trembled faintly, with something neither grief nor resentment, but plain, unhidden joy, and Cora Jane wore, pinned at her collar, the silver thimble he had given back to her that same morning, insisting she keep it after all, saying a woman ought to carry her own mother's promise even once she'd found a second family worth staying for. And the 2 objects, ring and thimble, sat together, as the whole visible history of 2 people who had each built a private armor out of loss, and had finally, slowly, dismantled it in front of somebody safe enough to see it fall. Years later, when the story got told the way stories get told in towns that size, worn smooth as riverstone, by every fresh retelling, it was Nora Fenwick, grown properly old by then, who told it best, sitting on her own porch of an evening, with the whole tale settled comfortably into its familiar shape. She would tell how a man had paid cash money for a wife, the way he might have paid for a plow horse, thinking a business arrangement was safer than a feeling one, and how a woman had answered that advertisement believing herself lucky simply to find a roof that wouldn't be pulled away in another 18 months, and how the 2 of them, neither one expecting anything past bare survival, had discovered instead, one hard season at a time, that survival was never really the whole of what a person needed. She would tell how the woman's rule, never cry where it can be seen, never ask for more than the minimum, always give the credit away, had been built out of real and reasonable fear, the kind any woman without people behind her learns to build, and how the true measure of the home that woman found was not the drought turned back, or the bank stood down, or the barn rebuilt, real as all of that was, but the plain fact that she had finally found a house safe enough to set that rule down in, a family who wanted to hand her back the credit rather than take it from her, a man willing to finish his sentences instead of leaving them standing half-built in the dark. She would tell them that a ranch is never truly saved, by cattle driven early to a good market, or water rights held onto through a hard summer, though those things matter plenty to people who've had to worry over them firsthand. A ranch and a marriage, and a whole broken family besides, gets saved the way it gets built in the first place. One small unrewarded kindness at a time, one true thing finally spoken plain instead of swallowed back, one silver thimble handed over, not because it was owed but because it was at long last safe to give away. And she would tell them, last of all, that home was never a thing bought with $40 in a matchmaking agency's fee, whatever the paper said. Home was the plain stubborn choice, renewed every single evening at a shared table, to stay and to be seen staying by people who had finally earned the right to see it.